so I hate to come from that really awesome kind of demonstration that we all went through into graphs. But given that I'm a professor, this is my job, my bread and butter, I'm going to subject you to a few graphs. But they're going to be quite interesting in a lot of ways. So what you're looking at here is sort of the home page. If you Google Anthropocene and go to the Anthropocene working group, this is the first thing that you'll see. And you don't have to worry so much about any of the units on any of the axes. What you have to see in all of these are the same shapes, right? You kind of have a little bit of gray out here at the 1750s, and by the 2000s, you see most of the graph, right, is covered in gray. We are entering, or have actually significantly entered, a period called the Great Acceleration. Everything that we could possibly measure is either going up or down with that same shape. Okay, so atmospheric carbon dioxide concentration, that we all know very well. Ocean ecosystems, urban population, paper consumption, McDonald's restaurants, in fact, as well too. We are seeing this across every single thing we can measure, right? Even our own emotions, our own psychologies, particularly now. And we have to consider, right, what all of these sharp increases, this great acceleration is doing, what sorts of pressures it's putting on our ecosystem, on our environment, on our people, on our governments, right, on all of these things that we depend on. And so I'm going to take a moment to caveat and apologize here. This is what happens when you start writing slides at the end of a semester, when you've written so many slides. There are a few words here that don't belong here. But I'll walk you through it. I think what was really amazing about the piece we just came through was that it was visceral, right? We just all experienced that. And when you hear the stories that you hear, I think Monica summed it up well, right? It kind of evokes these feelings of unjustness, right? Of pain. And the feeling that we should all be doing something, and we should be doing something right away to target this problem, and we should be fixing it. And we absolutely should. The question that kind of stifles me is the how, right? It turns out that as simple as it is to feel what we feel, right? The problems, what instigates migration, right? And even the refugee crisis that we're seeing can be quite complicated. And climate change is just one of them. So I'm going to talk mostly about the climate change component now, because I think we have an esteemed panel here who's going to be talking about some of the other factors. But I just want to put what we're seeing with this mass migration, this mass movement of people, more than really we've ever seen before in some ways. I want to contextualize this within our environment, right? So climate change, right? Climate change is actually many different things to many different people and many different ecosystems. We've got long-term climate change, which can exacerbate difficult conditions that already exist, right? These are the changes that we're going to expect in 30 years, in 40 years, by the end of the century, right? Things that are slow, changes that are slow, migration that is slow. In addition to that, we've got short-term climate events. We've got El Niños. We've got extremes that can spur migration in an instant, effectively, right? These are the short-term climate events that may be caused by climate change, might be caused naturally too, but now we've got climate change on top of it that we have to consider, right? And so both of these things, long-term and short-term, are really difficult to predict. Yeah, we've got climate models. We know with pretty good confidence that our climate is changing, that our world is warming. But if you were to ask us to predict any one event across the globe, that's really hard, right? Think of your weather forecast in some ways. In addition to that, we need to have really good data on current background conditions, and I'll talk about what those might be in just a second. And so one of the things, if you're interested in having the science, is to basically help us collect data, right? Tell us what the state of things is so we can better predict how things might change. It turns out this is tougher to do than you might think. So we've got long-term changes in temperature and rainfall, right? These are things that we think about, that we feel, right? And we know that these are going to change into the future. We've also got changes in variability or frequency of heat extremes, of rainfall extremes, of droughts, right? Increasing drought-like conditions. We've also got one-off events, which I'll show you an example of in just a second. And all of these can change in ways that should read destabilize. These things can destabilize societies, okay? They can exacerbate change, and within that, infrastructure, and most importantly, and what I focus on, at least for emerging economies in the developing world, food, right? Agriculture, the availability of food. And so let's kind of take these things piece by piece. The first thing I want to talk about can be exacerbated by climate change, but in some ways it's not climate change driven at all. That's just land degradation. The ability of our ecosystems to support what we do, our lives, our food, our water, right? All these ecosystem services we think about. What you're looking at here is a fairly recent plot of degraded soils worldwide, right? No soil, we've got nothing, right? That's what gives us everything in some ways, even our water to a certain extent, right? If you're percolating through groundwater. And so what you can see in the red, the orange, and in part the brown, which are kind of the prevailing colors here, are different extents of soil degradation. So even before we start the climate change discussion, we're working with degraded conditions, okay? Now this can happen for a number of reasons, from the way that we currently farm in industrial agriculture, from even pastoral grazing systems, right, in semi-arid and dry environments, from wind erosion, from water erosion, and if there's conflict, right, nobody's going to be paying any attention to what the soils are doing, right, our baseline for ecosystem services. So we need to collect data to figure out what this background state looks like, right? Where are the areas where we're already having a problem producing food, right, and getting clean water and all of these things. Now, bear with me, this is a lot of plots on one chart. We like to do this in climate science, just cram as much information as we can in one figure. But this is important. What you're looking at here is what's called emergence. At what point in time do we emerge into a changed climate, right? Have we crossed that border to know that climate change is here and it's happening now? It's not some distant thing in the future. And so what you're seeing in these boxes are three different regions. That's region 1, kind of covering part of Saharan Africa in the north, region 3 in South America, and region 2 kind of all up there at the higher latitudes, spanning Siberia and parts of Russia. And so what you're seeing on that x-axis there are dates, right? Years, in fact, 2010, 2020, 2040, 2050. And what you're looking at are projections. At what point do all of our models, all of what we know as climate scientists, tell us that we have emerged? Climate change is here. For region 1, kind of across the semi-arid tropics, which happens to overlap some of the regions where we're seeing large amounts of refugees, large amounts of migration, large amounts of destabilization, these regions have frankly already emerged in large form. Okay, that's kind of what those plots are trying to show you. Where you see the biggest bars are those areas where we are pretty confident that climate change is here and it's happening now. Okay, we have warmed beyond what we've experienced in the past. Okay. In region 2 and region 3, which are at slightly higher latitudes, we expect that that will come within a few decades. Right? But for a large part of the world, it's here, it's now. The other thing that we need to be concerned about is not just hot temperatures, right? When we think of what drives drought, what drives instability, for some reason we always just associate that with heat, with hot, with anger, right? That kind of is part of that entire emotional tie. And what you'll see there is sort of the emergence of drought. Now, drought is a really important and separate issue from heat, right? They're related. But when you start looking at drought, you start losing soil moisture beyond just a season, beyond just a couple of seasons. Anyone here from California? A few of us, right? So we sort of know, well, I'm not, but you know, right, that drought is a sustained thing. And if you don't have all of the other structures in place, a social system that works, a government that cares, right, you're conflict-free, even in those conditions, in happy sunny California, we have a problem dealing with drought. Right? That's going to be a reality for much of the world. And so what you're seeing is by the end of the century, all of these pink, purple, red areas are areas for which we have much higher risks for drought. And that includes a large portion of the United States, but again, you start looking across the semi-arid tropics. Now, in some areas we're actually expecting more rainfall, but that's a little bit of, another issue. This is a picture from Chennai in 2015 in India, which is actually where I'm going in a few hours. Which is, hopefully it looks better than that right now when we land. But in 2015, you know, and Chennai is pretty well developed actually compared to a lot of other regions, and India has a pretty good social system, or at least the state does in the south of India. And in 2015, they got a year's worth of rainfall in about 2 weeks, about 1,200 millimeters. Their average for this time is about half that, okay? And it was flooded. These were actually pictures that we took from inside our vehicle as we were moving along, trying to get to our field sites. We actually didn't make it. There was actually water coming into the vehicle at the time that we took these images. And I show these, A, because I've experienced this, and even though this was driven by many other things, okay, this is what we're expecting in the future. So even for those areas, you know, even for those areas that we expect might be not quite as at risk of drought, we're seeing intensified rainfall, and that doesn't help anybody either, right? These extreme events, that's really hard to harness. And so ultimately what I'm concerned about, this is the last slide that I'll put up here, is how all of these things weave together to destabilize already really critical situations, and at the core, prevent us from accessing what are basic rights: food, water, right, in addition to sanitation and healthcare and all of these other things. But food and water, that's what I study, that's what I want to know. These are the changes in yields and agricultural production that we're expecting by 2100 under business as usual conditions. Right? And under most of these areas, right, the areas that we tend to be most concerned about, these emerging economies, these developing regions, right, we see lots of oranges and reds, up to 25, 30% declines in productivity because of climate change. And that is, of course, not factoring in completely that first chart I showed you on degraded soils. I don't mean to sound, I always have this problem ending my climate change class. It's a whole semester of just really horrible facts and thoughts, you know, and I don't mean to not sound hopeful on this front, but this is what complicates the way that I see migration and even short-term you know, these sort of large refugee crises that we find ourselves in today, in addition to all of the other political and socioeconomic factors moving on. So yeah, we need to stay in the Paris Agreement, first and foremost. We need to keep funding government research, right? Second and third, so we can get the data we need to better resolve this. And we need to start doing something about all of this, right? All of these disparate things, right? We like to think of climate change as one thing, and it's not, right? We need to be fighting across all of these different dimensions in order to create at least just the baseline state for which we can thrive. Right? We need to let climate change not be a contributing factor to migration, so that way we can start handling all of the other components. I hope that that's